In this 40th year of China's reform and opening up, President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. That's why we titled this series 40 Years and Counting, Transforming Reform and Opening Up for the New Era. What lessons have been learned? What challenges lie ahead? In this first episode, we explore the big vision and broad guidance of China's reform and opening up policies. 40 years ago, in December 1978, Deng Xiaoping delivered his historic speech, "Emancipate the mind, seek truth from facts, and unite as one to face the future," setting into motion the 4 astonishing decades of reform and opening up that transformed China into the world's second largest economy. In 1977, 28 years after the founding of the People's Republic, the country's annual per capita GDP was about $185. In 2018, China's annual per capita GDP is almost $9,000, an increase of almost 50 times. While China's development is rightly called an economic miracle, it is not mysterious. Reform and opening up made it happen. In this special series on China's 40 years of reform and opening up, we review the past to guide the future. We prioritize economic reform, but we recognize governance, development, and social reform. And we ask why, after 4 decades, does China still need to reform and open up further? That's our plan to be closer to China.
When we meet with Yu Haibo, a photographer, he's in a tangle of small streets in central Shenzhen.
80年代，这就是深圳的老街。
This is Laojie, the original merchant street in Shenzhen in the 1980s.
一户接一户的，那个时候这也是最繁华的地方。这个麦当劳也是中国第一家麦当劳。
This is the first McDonald's. People used to line up for fast food.
麦当劳当时人排着长队来吃麦当劳。
Laojie, meaning old street in Chinese, has existed for decades, which is certainly not the case for most of Shenzhen.
Back then, there were few Shenzhen locals on this street. The same thing can be said about Shenzhen.
Shenzhen, a city of around 13 million people, is now a leading global technology hub. The city exemplifies China's economic boom, reflecting China's reform and opening up policy, which was announced in late 1978. This 40-year anniversary marks China's continuous economic growth, a dramatic improvement of the Chinese people's living standards, the country's deeper and more complex interaction with other economies, and the nation's increasing role in global affairs.
Today, the Chinese people can say with great pride that reform and opening, China's second revolution, has not only profoundly changed the country, but also greatly influenced the whole world.
Reform and opening up is described as China's second revolution, meaning that its importance can be compared to that of the founding of the People's Republic. On the other hand, China faces daunting challenges and risks: slower growth, social imbalances, massive pollution, global volatility. At this new starting point for comprehensively deepening reform, I sit down with Mr. Gao Xiangchuan, former Deputy Minister in charge of China's economic reform planning since the 1980s, and his successor, Mr. Peng Sun. I ask, how will China inject new impetus into economic and social development? I speak with Mr. Bert Hoffman and Professor Justin Yifu Lin, world-leading economists who have been tracking China's reform and opening up since its inception. I ask, to avoid obstacles and overcome difficulties, how will China develop its own path? And I meet with Professor Zheng Bijian, longtime senior advisor to China's leadership and the author of China's Doctrine of Peaceful Rise. I ask, how will China interact with the world?
What's the overview of China's reform and opening up policy, its grand vision?
Deng Xiaoping shared three observations about that era. First, the period of reform and opening up has truly revitalized China. Second, it enabled China to catch up with the times. Third, the goal is to revitalize the entire Chinese nation. The emphasis of these three statements is that while revolution is to unfetter the productive forces, reform also aims to unfetter the productive forces. Thus, what's taken shape is an independent socialist path with Chinese characteristics, which is linked with rather than detached from economic globalization.
It's a miracle in human history, not only in Chinese history. We had never observed such a high growth rate to be sustained for such a long time. We have never been observed so many people have been deep out of poverty in such a short period of time. As you know, poverty reduction has been a goal for global development community since the Second World War. Every country tried very hard to industrialize, to modernize, and to improve the living of the people, and to enhance the national status.
The highlight is, I think, the start of the reforms, and Deng Xiaoping's famous speech, "Seeking truth from facts, emancipate the mind and unite as one," at the Central Economic Work Conference in 1978, which basically brings a different mindset to China and shifts the thinking from a much more political view of the world to a much more developmental view of the world. And pulling that off was enormously important for reforms.
What are its phases or stages?
The first phase was the establishment of 14 special districts, including Shenzhen, and the creation of household responsibility agriculture system. The second phase was marked by Deng Xiaoping's tour of the South in 1992, building up a socialist market economy and accession to the WTO. The third phase was building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, featuring scientific, harmonious, and peaceful development. Then in 2012, the 18th CPC National Congress ushered in the fourth phase.
In December 1978, at the third plenary session of the 11th CPC Central Committee, a decision was made that marks the beginning of China's reform. This phase continued until 1992, when a socialist market economy was proposed at the 14th CPC National Congress. In the first phase, the main task was to re-examine the planned economy, commodity economy, market economy, and to identify a model for reform. From 1992 to 2002, those 10 years were a phase in which China came up with its own model, built up a socialist market economy, and continually upgraded its system. Since 2012 up till now, the past 6 years have been a new phase, to comprehensively deepen reform in accordance with the Central Committee's overall plan to promote economic, political, cultural, social, and ecological progress.
I defined 3 phases of reforms, and the first phase up until 92 I call market seeking, i.e. China wanted to have more influence on market economy but didn't quite know how, and didn't quite know how to manage a more market-based economy. And I think then after 92, what I would call, you get a phase of market building reforms, a really strong push, not just the macroeconomic management, but also state enterprise reforms, phasing out of the planning system, phasing out of most of the price controls, phasing out most of the distributions, including the grain distribution. It's a big push for more market. And basically, those are the Zhurongji era, if you want. But then after that, there's a different nature of China's socialist market economy happening, and I call it market enhancing. I still believe that the market is the biggest part of the economy, but industrial policy is starting to play a bigger role, especially since the early part of this decade. The other part of market enhancing is that China starts paying more attention to the social side. Healthcare, education, social protection, the DBA system that is being introduced at the end of the 90s starts to spread around the country. So it's basically the softer side of the market economy.
Initially, reform targeted the economy, but the first challenge it faced was how to change people's minds. Although political pragmatism began gathering momentum after the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the CPC in late 1978, controversies and debates on ideological and political matters have never ended. Because Marxist literature does not endorse non-public ownership, certainly not privatization, the question of private property was one of the most fundamental challenges to economic reform. Let's look at that first stage from the end of 1978, the third plenary of the 11th Party Congress, until 1992. So during that period, what were the different arguments being heard?
The most serious problem we encountered during that initial stage of reform were the differences in understanding of reform itself. From the traditional perspective, socialism must be accompanied by a planned economy. A market economy can only be found under capitalism. When China adopted its reform and opening up policies toward a market economy, some people questioned if China was adhering to the socialist path. That argument was a scary one because it targeted the core of socialism. The list goes on when it comes to the debate over ideology. By 1992, even after 14 years of reform, the contention over whether China's reform was a socialist or capitalist one never stopped.
At the end of the 1980s, there were problems in China. What can you say about that in the process of the 40 years, that period of time, and what can we learn from that for the future?
It's like a period of adjustment. You know, in 1988, as China's domestic economy slightly overheated, the inflation rate surged to 17%, 18%, and even approached 20%. Back then, China experienced major turbulence. European countries and the U.S. applied sanctions to China, which didn't end after 1 or 2 years, but lasted a long time. As a result, China's economic growth dropped rapidly in 1990, from a high growth rate to a negative growth. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping once again decided to open the economy, now even further. During his landmark southern tour, he popularized the idea of opening wider to the outside world. At that critical juncture, China chose this path, rather than a regression to conservatism.
So that was an interesting year because 1992 was when Deng Xiaoping made his Nanshun, which accelerated reform, and then the 14th Party Congress in the fall of 1992 instituted officially the socialist market economy.
Deng Xiaoping's talks during his southern tour marked a significant moment in China's history of reform. He took that tour because he wasn't satisfied with the pace of reform or the progress made. Reform is like a boat traveling upstream. You must press ahead or you fall behind. Deng made 2 points. First, whoever didn't support reform should be removed from office. It was quite harsh. Second, Deng said that socialism had a market, capitalism had a plan. So plan and market weren't exclusive to a certain social system, but methods or means to allocate resources.
Some people would have said that to bring the word socialist and market together in one short phrase is what we call an oxymoron, like a bright night or something, a round square. But in China that has real meaning. So tell me your perception of the socialist market economy when it began, in roughly 1992, 1993, and how it's progressed.
Well, the way I see the socialist market economy is if you want, a mixed economy with a relatively strong emphasis on state ownership and a strong emphasis on state leadership in the economy. And those are the characteristics that I see in China, and China is defined as a socialist market economy. And that, of course, is how China has been functioning since 1992, with an increasing share of the economy left to the market, but still with a relatively strong state presence, both in economic activity as well as in steering and directing the economy, more than you would see in most OECD countries. So that is, if you want, for me, the socialist market economy.
Whether it's in China or in other countries, if it's a market economy, then one commonality is that the market must play a decisive role in allocating resources. China's socialist market economy, however, had its uniqueness. It's a relationship between generality and particularity. The particularity is that China, as a socialist country, emphasizes a basic economic system that rests on public ownership, but allows all forms of private ownership to develop too. The second feature is that China's reform preserves a people-centric value. The reform aims to achieve comprehensive development of the economy to benefit the whole of society and all people. The third feature is to enable government to play a more effective role. We now stress the need to further improve the state's guidance in its development strategy, planning, and the macro control system of our financial and monetary policies.
And you do see a trend in the reduction of government in terms of specific ministries that were originally planning ministries that got combined. And it's been an up and down process, but overall the trend has been for smaller government control.
But that's, I mean, frankly, the central government remains extraordinarily small in this country, and one would say maybe too small in some aspects. It's not so much the size of the government, but the government needs to be capable to deliver the regulations and the services that the economy and if you want, the people require from it. So it's not one size fits all. I think that is also a discussion that one can think about. The more increased centralization of authority in a number of areas is probably very desirable.
Private businesses began in the mid-1980s, and since then, broadly, restrictions on private businesses and government interventions continue to decrease. And while there was retrenchment in the early 1990s, reforms accelerated after 1992. At the 16th CPC National Congress in 2002, the private economy was recognized as an important part of the socialist market economy. In 2004, China's National People's Congress approved constitutional amendments that addressed private property rights and human rights. In the next year, 2005, China's private sector GDP exceeded 50% of its total GDP. And since then, the private sector has continued to expand. Private business put the country on the fast track of economic growth.
In 2001, China's accession to the WTO was not only a milestone in the country's reform and opening up, it also marked China's commitment to multilateralism. In 2010, China surpassed Japan and became the world's second largest economy. In 2013, China's international trade reached $4.16 trillion US, becoming the world's largest trading nation. In 2016, China's yuan was officially added to the IMF's SDR basket, which recognized and reinforced the country's continuing reforms. In 2017, at the 19th CPC National Congress, Party General Secretary Xi Jinping announced that socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era, and that the CPC has a two-stage development plan for the period from 2020 to the middle of the 21st century to 2050, to develop China into a great, modern, socialist country. General Secretary Xi also declared that China will not close its door to the world, it will only open it more and more.
After 4 decades of reform and opening up, why must China now, in China's new era, comprehensively deepen reform and further opening up? And what can we learn from the past 40 years that could help us with the new kind of reform and opening up that China needs in its new era?
I believe there are two factors. The first is a requisite of domestic growth. Fundamentally, domestic growth must meet public's aspirations for a good life by scaling to new heights of productivity. No stagnation can be tolerated. If productivity grinds to a halt, what could we call this? The Latin American trap. The fundamental lesson from that is stagnation. The most crucial cause is when industry restructuring and productivity fail to keep pace. Yet domestic growth is a national factor. The second reason is the international environment. What is the global situation in the first half of the 21st century? The most important feature is a major change in productive forces. This should not be ignored, because it may spur a serious shift in international relations, especially in Sino-US relations between the two world's largest economies.
China's reform and opening up aims to unfetter and develop the forces of production and to realize China's drive to modernize. Reform and opening up will never stop until China achieves full modernization. So, after several rounds of reform, it's now come to the stage of how to advance our reforms comprehensively. It's a tough battle and arduous task.
Reform is said to have now entered the deep waters. There is talk of interest groups, a vague term of people or groups of people, industries, geography, sectors that oppose reform in one way or another. What is the deep water of reform? What or who are the interest groups? And how can China now comprehensively deepen reform, as President Xi Jinping requires, with these problems out there?
Reform has now entered a deep water zone. Why do we call it that? Because we've already done the easy part of the job. But now it's really difficult to tackle these vested interests. The central authorities and the State Council have already committed themselves to reform. It's like a self-revolution to carry out such a reform of party and state institutions. In the past, the revolution seemed irrelevant to their interest, but now it's relevant. That makes it more difficult. Though the central authorities seem determined to reform, balancing between these interest groups is a slow, complicated process. First, we must liberalize our minds, then boldly tackle such groups.
This deep water zone has three features. First, it's more difficult. Reforms up to this point were incremental and driven by the need to increase social prosperity with shared dividends for all. From here, further reform involves the adjusting of interests at deeper levels, which also brings greater resistance. Second, there are more risks. In the past, we waded across the river by feeling for the stones below, yet made great advances through this exploration. Now, opening our economy even wider, we enter a vast ocean of the market economy, and we can no longer touch the bottom. To push reform, theory guidance or top-level design must be in place, otherwise it would be very risky. Third, reform may be urgent and pressing. There are deep-level reforms that cannot be delayed. Various risks, such as unbalanced economic growth and socialist contradictions, require that we speed up reform. So that's how we define this deep water zone, the urgent, deep, difficult and risky problems that we encounter along the path of reform.
If you had to define the primary challenges for deepening reform and furthering opening up in the future, what would you say are the main categories?
I will always say it's ideas. Do we have the right ideas about the nature of the problems? And do we have the right ideas about the reality in the countries, and so we can, overcome those kind of problems and lead the country forward.
From your experience looking back on 40 years of reform and opening up, and now looking ahead in this new era, what are the kinds of lessons that can be learned or principles that can be applied during that period of time?
First, China's reform must adhere to the principles of emancipating minds and draw out the truth from facts. That means take action in accordance with objective laws. Second, the ultimate goal of China's reform is to advance forces of production. Reform itself is not an end, but a means to an end, to serve economic growth. The essence of reform is to unfetter and develop these productive forces by upgrading the production relationship and superstructures. One great lesson learned is that we could make audacious explorations in anything to promote productive forces. Third, and this is crucial, China took a gradual approach to reform. Fourth, and also very important, we must adhere to marketization. We already mentioned that the most effective way to allocate resources is to allow the market to play a decisive role. We should not be bothered by arguments like whether our last name is socialism or capitalism, but remain committed to our own path. Surely, we must appropriately handle relations among reform, development and stability. Before major reform measures rolled out, the supply and demand relationship of our entire economic structure can't be too tight, but offer some leeway for reform advancement.
During these 40 years of reform and opening up, China hasn't made a fatal mistake. It's unrealistic to never make a single mistake, but at least we've made no fatal mistakes. Why? General Secretary Xi Jinping had a unique and interesting summary, which I like very much. He says that China's reform has its own directions, positions, and principles. Why do we say that China's reform has had its own directions, positions, and principles? Because we defined reform as a complete transformation of our outdated system, which had constrained the forces of productivity, as well as the self-improvement of the basic socialist system. In other words, reform does not mean abandoning socialism, but rather to transform the systems that hinder the development of productive forces. This is a crucial distinction. Second, we have a very clear understanding of what can be reformed and what cannot be. We can't reform everything. For instance, we replaced the traditional planned economic system with a socialist market economy. However, the political system is different. That can't be replaced, but only improved. Our system was built in light of China's national conditions and with Chinese characteristics. Our system is not perfect, but still not to be replaced. In identifying what can be reformed, we choose to draw from our own principles. That's why Xi Jinping says our reform has its own unique directions, positions, and principles.
When historians of the future write the long history of China, these 40 years of reform and opening up will surely be a highlight. Indeed, when historians of the future write the long history of the whole world, China's transformational period of reform and opening up will be a feature. There are challenges, of course: slower growth, mounting debt, financial risk, industrial overcapacity, massive pollution, social disparity, poverty amidst wealth, global volatility. How to address such diverse, complex issues? President Xi Jinping calls for comprehensively deepening reform and further opening up. How to navigate the deep waters of reform, overcome entrenched interest groups? Lessons can be learned from past experiences, including thought liberation and practical actions being more important than empty talk. For the following 4 weeks, we explore China's remarkable 40 years of reform and opening up. In the next episode, we discern key factors driving the country's extraordinary economic miracle. That's Closer to China.